Good evening, everyone. My name is Allison Black, and I'm a programming specialist at the Halifax Central Library. It's wonderful to welcome you to the Paul O'Regan Hall tonight for this lecture. I wish to begin this evening's event by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki. We live, work, and play on ancestral land that belongs to the Mi'kmaq people, the First Peoples of Nova Scotia. As we seek to build a more inclusive municipality, we remember that we are all treaty people. Before I hand over the microphone to Pauline, who will be leading the opening remarks, I want to mention that this program is being recorded and will be available at a later date. In addition, when we started to plan this program a few months ago, Pauline recommended a book that she found very helpful called The Neuroscience of Suicidal Behaviour by Kees van Haringen. We've added this book to our library collection, and I can help you place a hold on it if you're interested after the program. I'm happy this resource is available at the library. And now to hand over the microphone to Pauline. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Before I begin with my personal introduction, I would just like to say that we have among our gathered group here a number of individuals who have been working steadily in this field. Among them are from the Canadian Mental Health Association, the Halifax Dartmouth branch, co-managers Bev Cadam and Marg Murray. We've had the support from the Association of Psychologists of Nova Scotia, as well as the Dalhousie Department of Psychiatry. And from this Department of Psychiatry this evening, we have Dr. Martin Alda, and my husband in a couple of minutes will do an introduction of Dr. Alda, as well Dr. Lara Hazelton, who is the Deputy Head and Director of Education, the Department of Psychiatry at Dalhousie. As well, we have Dr. Samuel Hickox, who is the Chief Officer for Addictions and Mental Health with the Nova Scotia Department of Health and Wellness, and he's the Medical Director of the Atlantic Mentorship Network for Pain and Addictions with Nova Scotia Health. Our older son, Daniel, died by suicide in January 2020, and the lost personal and human potential has been and will continue to be immense and immeasurable. The recently deceased Madeleine Albright, American diplomat and political science, once said, "The act of striving is the only way to keep faith with life." To this end, keeping faith with life, with effort and good fortune, and through relevant and timely input from a family friend, we have arranged tonight's lecture by Dr. Turecki in Dan's memory. We have been honored by Dr. Turecki's ready acceptance to join us this evening. My husband, Elliot Suto, will introduce Dr. Martin Alda, and Dr. Alda will do the academic introduction for Dr. Turecki.
Good evening. It is my privilege tonight to introduce Dr. Martin Alda, who will be introducing our guest speaker. Dr. Alda is professor and Killam Chair in the Department of Psychiatry, Dalhousie University, and director of the Mood Disorders Program at the Nova Scotia Health Authority. Dr. Alda was born in Czechoslovakia and trained in medicine and psychiatry at Charles University in Prague. After arriving in Canada, he trained and collaborated with Professor Paul Graf at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Alda has worked closely with Dr. Turecki since 1994 on studies of bipolar disorder, its response to treatment, and studies in suicide behavior. Dr. Alda.
Good evening, everybody. It's great to see this large audience, and when I was thinking who would be the best person to give a lecture like you're going to hear tonight, I couldn't think of a better person than Professor Turecki. He has made seminal contributions to our understanding of many aspects that relate to the risk of suicide, including the neurobiology of suicide, studies of depression, and also major contributions in our understanding how early trauma affects developing brain. He has been awarded many awards for his work, up over 30, and I would not do full justice to list them all, but he is, among others, the Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He's the member of the National Academy of Medicine in the United States. He has got major awards in Canada and internationally, both for work in mood disorders and suicide. So I am looking forward to his talk. And on a personal note, Gustavo and I have collaborated this year for 28 years. He has had a wonderful sense of humor, and he's been a great friend, and I'm thrilled to see him here tonight. Please, Gustavo.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. Above everything, I'm honored to be here in an event such as this one being organized by Pauline, Elliot, and their family. It's fantastic to see a difficult moment of life transformed into something that can help other people and share the experience with other people. So it's really good to be here tonight and to spend some time with you. So you have to excuse me a little bit. I'm a little bit rusty after 2 years or so, mostly doing virtual talks. So, but I'm sure I'm going to warm up as we move along. So first, let's just define, yes, what do we mean by suicide and suicidal behaviors? So suicide, when we talk about suicide, we refer to people who died by suicide. Then there is the term that we use, suicide attempts, that basically means people who tried to end their lives, sometimes with or without a very clear intent. Then we talk about suicide ideation, which basically means thinking about suicide. And one can think about suicide in many different contexts, or think about ending their lives. And then we typically divide this in two types, passive thoughts, or thinking about it, but thinking only indirectly, such as, I wish I was dead, that, let's say, an illness or something happened, but wouldn't do anything about it. And then active thoughts, when we actually think and plan about dying by suicide. Then there are the so-called NSSI, or non-suicidal behavior, which is basically acts of self-injury without an intent to die. So the most typical example of that was when people cut themselves, and often they do so as a way to release emotional pain. And then there is a more general term that it's used in the literature, which is self-harm, that relates to a combination of all the forms of behavior without suicide ideation. Okay, so now that we reviewed a little bit the terminology, I'm going to be mostly talking about death by suicide, yes? But we'll talk a little bit about, as well, suicidal ideation sometimes and suicidal behavior in the form of suicide attempt. But when we think about that, I just want you to realize, yes, that the relationship between them is such that death by suicide is a much, it's a rare event, relatively rare compared to the other ones. A lot of people think about suicide, yet sometime in their lives, in a population. Of those, some attempt and relatively few die by suicide. So when we think about individuals who die by suicide, it's important to keep in mind that almost 1 million people die by suicide per year around the world. It's quite a lot of people. In fact, more people die by suicide than die in all wars combined. So if you take people who die, in the world, around the world, and then you put them together, it's not the same as people who die by suicide. Yes, but we don't often know about this. Yes, we don't often talk about this. So that's why sometimes suicide has been called as the quiet epidemic, in the sense that it's there, but nobody knows about it. And it's particularly more disturbing when we think that it's among the first causes of death for young people. Yes, because it affects a lot of young people. So when we think about the distribution of suicide around the world, what do we see? So this is a map, where you have countries like Russia with very high rates, and then you have other countries that have lower rates, like South America or some countries in Africa. And then you have countries like Canada and the United States and Europe that have rates somewhere in the middle. So about 4,000 people die by suicide, every year here in Canada. Men are more affected, in the sense dying more by suicide than women, in a ratio that it's 3 to 4 to 1. Although this varies a little bit from time to time, it varies a little bit from period to period. Women, yet, are more likely to attempt suicide, and 3 to 4 times more likely than men, and are also more likely to be hospitalized. So already there you see that if you're trying to prevent death by suicide, yes, there is something that we're not doing quite right. Yes? And then about 14% of the general population report that they thought about suicide sometimes, yes, in their lifetime. And about 3.5% attempted suicide in their lives. And there you have that about a third of all deaths by suicide occur in an age group of about, between 40 and 60. So here you have a distribution of suicide deaths through the provinces in Canada. And what you see here is that this is from 2019. In Canada, the highest rates in this year were in Saskatchewan. Now, this varies over time. Yes, so there are other times where other provinces would have higher rates than the other ones. Here you have Nova Scotia. It's where the rates are about the same as the general rates of suicide in Canada, which are about 12 over 100,000 individuals. Now, as I said, suicide rates vary over time. Yes? So here you have the distribution of suicide rates in a relatively short period of time, 15 years, in different countries. And you would see that there's quite a lot of variation in some countries, and in other countries less. In some countries, the rates go down. In other countries like the US, the rates have gone up over the last few years. The same thing when you look at distribution of suicide rates in Canada. You would see that when you look at between 2000 and this is 2010 and 20, across the provinces, you see that there's quite a lot of variation in suicide rates. Yes, when you look at the provinces. But this really pales when you put into account and you look at the suicide rates in the territories, yes, and particularly Nunavut, yes, which has much, much higher, almost 10 times higher the rates of suicide than in Canada. Okay, so why do people die by suicide or think about suicide? What do we know about it? Yes? So clearly suicide is a complex phenomenon, and there's no a single explanation to understand suicide and suicidal behaviors. Yes? So, and this is, I think if I can give you a message today, it's that suicide is complex. Yes? So I don't want you to leave this lecture thinking that it's one particular cause that I know that we discussed. So it is complex, and in each case is different. Yes? But there are a few factors that are common, or there are a few factors that you see more often when you study the lives of people who die by suicide. One of the factors that is by far the most important to think about is psychopathology. And what do we mean by psychopathology? Psychopathology is basically mental disorders, yes, mental illness. So having been affected with depression, having been affected with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, so these are very important risk factors, yes? So, but in general, when we think about suicide risk, yes, and how do we think about it today? We think that individuals who die by suicide, in one hand, they have a given predisposition that it's conferred by factors, yes, by risk factors that act more distally to the suicide. In other words, factors that were present there much earlier than the time of death. Okay? So these factors here, they increase predisposition. On the other hand, there are factors that act more proximately to the suicide event. And so these factors are thought as triggering factors, factors that are closely associated with suicide. Yes, and then, so what I would like to do with you tonight is go over some of these factors and give you examples of how they act and how is that they increase risk. Now, this is at the individual level. Yes, all of these factors here increase predisposition or precipitate a suicidal crisis at the individual level. There are as well other factors that act at the environmental level, yet that at the population level, that explain primarily or help us understand why is that there is this variability over time, and why is that some regions, some places around the world have higher or lower rates of suicide, or why is, for instance, that in in territories like Nunavut, there are much higher rates of suicides compared to the other ones. This difference in suicide rates is not explained by individual factors. Yes? It's not that people, let's say, in Russia are more at risk of dying by suicide because of the way they are born or something else. Yes? It's because in one particular time, there are factors that increase the risk of facilitate that people die by suicide. So one very clear example, yes, if you think, I told you that in the United States, suicide rates have gone up, yes? So what we think is that the easy access to lethal means, like guns, for instance, yes, explain the fact that people are more likely to die by suicide when they are going through, let's say, an episode and they have suicidal thoughts. Okay? So far, so good? All right. So let's talk a little bit about the distal factors. Yes, so these factors that increase predisposition to suicide. Okay, so first, yep, this picture here is just to remind me to talk about familial factors, yes, in particular, the role of genes. So this child here is Ernest Hemingway, yes, who we know very well because of the books, the wonderful books he wrote. But we also, and you may know, that he died by suicide. Not only did he die by suicide, his father died by suicide, his brother died by suicide, his granddaughter died by suicide, so a lot of people within his family died by suicide. Later on, studies have shown that suicides can run in families. Does not necessarily run in families, but can run in families. Yes, and for instance, this is a study that was done already a long time ago in the 80s in the Amish population. Yes, so you may know about the Amish. You know, these are a close-knit population that has remained very insular, and there's a lot of support over there, and they have excellent records. In the Amish population, there are not a lot of suicides, yes, but the suicides that they had, almost all of the suicides in that population were concentrated in 4 families. Yes? Now, I told you that suicide, one very important risk factor for suicide is psychopathology. Yes? Psychopathology also runs in families. So this study was instrumental to show that whereas a lot of families in the Amish clustered psychopathology, yes, or had number of cases of psychopathology like depression, for instance, very few had depression and suicide. Yes, so these 4 families sort of concentrated this. So this study was one of the first to suggest that there are genetic risk factors for suicide that are manifested, yes, when psychopathology is present, but they are not explained by the same genetic factors that explain psychopathology. Okay? So since then, a lot of effort has been put to trying to identify, you know, if suicide runs in families, so what are the genetic factors that could explain, yes, that familial aggregation of suicide? So we don't know yet, yes, but there are some clues. So for instance, this is a very recent study showing that in a part of the chromosome 7, yes, there is a gene that increases predisposition for suicidal behavior, in this case, suicide attempts. Now, I don't want you to think that genes make individuals die by suicide, yes, because that's not how we conceptualize, at least. What we think is that genes may increase risk for some other factor that in turn increase risk for suicide. Okay? And what could be those factors? One example is our personality traits, yes, and particularly impulsive aggressive behaviors. So one of the things we see when we study individuals who die by suicide very often is that they tend, as a group, and again, not necessarily at each individual case, but as a group, they tend to have higher rates of impulsivity, yes, and as well higher rates of impulsive aggressive behaviors. Yeah, so just the tendency to act without thinking or making decisions quickly and engaging in some sort of aggressive behavior. So that's, as a group, we see more often. And one of the things that we've found is studying families that had several cases of suicide. What we found is that often, yes, what explained that familial transmission of suicidal behavior in those families was the distribution, was the segregation, yes, of these impulsive aggressive traits. Okay? Now, again, I just want to make sure that this is very clear, is that that does not explain every single case of suicide. It's just that there's a subgroup of individuals that manifest that. But as when you look at individuals as a whole, that's what you see. And again, does not necessarily mean that suicide runs always in families, and that necessarily because there is someone in your family that died by suicide, that the rest of the people in the family are more at risk. Another important factor that we see that acts distally, yes, is early life stress. So early life stress can be negative experiences early on in life, either traumatic experiences. And when we look at those experiences and we see the relationship, yes, we see that, again, as a group, individuals who die by suicide tend to have more of these negative early life experiences, yes, this early life stress. So how can adversity early on in life, yes, influence suicide risk? So we have some idea about this from studies that looked at the relationship between early life experience and suicidal behavior, and followed up over time individuals over many, many years. So this is called cohort studies. So when we do this type of studies, one of the things that we see is that the relationship between adversity or early life stress and suicidal behavior is explained by a different developmental trajectory. In other words, is explained by how these children develop, yes, and some behaviors that they manifest that seem to increase risk of suicide and suicidal behaviors. So over the years, we developed this hypothesis that the distal factors, yes, such as genes or early life stress, lead to a differential development, for instance, by causing these individuals to be more anxious, yes, or have more impulsive traits. And then that leads to an increased risk of suicidal behavior. So then the question is, how can this differential trajectory of these traits lead to, the exposure to stress early on in life lead to this differential development of personality traits such as anxiousness or anxiety or impulsivity. So our brain, yes, is what we call plastic, yes? So by plastic, I mean the brain adapts with experience, yes? That's the key function of the brain. So, you know, intuitive examples about that, it's, for instance, learning to play, you know, learning to a language, yes? So we learn a language, the brain codes the language, yes, and learns to speak the language. There are other intuitive examples about that, like learning music early on in life or learning many other things. What we've learned, yes, and over the last decades, is that this plasticity in the brain is also present in behavioral development. We learn behaviors, we adapt, and there are periods in life in which our brain is sort of more open to be regulated by the experience, yes? So, and those periods are early on in life, yes? We call these critical periods. So, through these critical periods, when our brain is learns and is primed about all these basic functions, a lot of it at the molecular level is explained by what we call epigenetic regulation. So epigenetic regulation is basically the way our organism has to adapt, yes, better our organism to the environment in which we live. Yes? And the brain, it's an organ that has a function. Primarily what it does, yes, is better equip the organism, to deal with the environment both socially and physically. Yes? And these molecular mechanisms are key to help the brain adapt and help all the brain processes better respond to environmental needs and the needs of the organism. Now, our brain is unique in our body because it's particularly regulated by these epigenetic processes. And there are some of these processes that are particular to the brain that you almost don't see in other parts of the body. Yes? So one of these is the so-called CAC methylation, for instance. Yes? That it's highly abundant in the brain and not so much abundant in other parts of our body. And this CAC methylation accumulates as the person grows in the first years of life, yes, until around the age of puberty. And so as the neurons in the brain develop and explore and learn things, this type of methylation accumulates. So it is key to better understand the relationship between environmental experience, yes, and regulation of brain functions. So let me give you one example. And this is an example of a study that we did now almost 15 years ago, where we study individuals who died by suicide and had this early life stress or had traumatic events early on in life. And we study a part of the brain, yes, that it's key in the regulation of stress. So we study the hippocampus and study in particular a receptor in the hippocampus that where the stress hormone, yes, the glucocorticoid, binds. And what we saw was that individuals who died by suicide and had traumatic events early on in life, they had increased changes in methylation, in this type of epigenetic marks, in a key area of the brain that regulates response to stress, yes? But not individuals who died by suicide and did not have histories of early life stress, yes, or early life adversity, nor individuals who died from other causes. So having more of these changes in the brain, what it does is that impacts the capacity of that gene to respond to this hormone of the stress. So let me put this together, and hopefully, if it wasn't clear, it will be clear now. So here you have a graph where in your right you would have just normal, in your left you would have normal development, and on your right you would have the situation of someone who was exposed to early life adversity and had early life stress. So, as I told you, early life stress leads to these differences in epigenetic regulation, that lead to different amounts of this receptor that detects the stress hormone. So normally what happens is that when we are under stress, yes, our adrenal gland releases cortisol, yes, that is the stress hormone, and it will then go back, yes, to the brain and give a signal for the brain to stop activating and releasing cortisol. So when we have a normal situation, this signal, this what we call negative feedback, works very well. And then what happens is that the system here stops being activated. When we have less amount of these receptors here, what happens is that the system remains being activated even though it should be suppressed. So as a result, yes, the organism is under constant stress. Yes? So we think this is somewhat of an adaptive mechanism that helps the brain better cope with situations of stress. But as a result, yes, in other moments, it leads the person with increased anxiety and constantly being activated or anxious. So it's one example of a possible mechanism that may help explain, in some cases, the relationship between early life stress and increased risk of suicidal behaviors. Because I told you that early life adversity and early life stress link to suicidal behavior by leading to differential personality traits. And one way would be through, for instance, leading to these traits that increase anxiety responses. Okay. So those would be examples of more distal factors. Now let's talk about more proximal factors. Yes? So the distal factors are these ones that act at distance increase in predisposition, the proximal factors are those that act more closely to the suicide event, yes, precipitating suicidal behavior. Okay, so a very intuitive risk factor for suicidal behavior are life stress, yes? Often when we learn about someone who died by suicide, the first question that we think is what happened, yes? So these are, more than anything, are factors that trigger, yes, that act as triggers of suicidal behavior. And the best way for us to understand them is that they trigger psychopathology, yes, they trigger conditions like depression or depressive episodes or other forms of mental illnesses that then will increase risk of suicidal behavior. There is no particular life stressor that would affect. There is no more of one or the other. It's about the presence of life stressors. So when we study and look at the histories of individuals who die by suicide, very, very often we see that close to the event there were significant life stressors, but not necessarily. There are other cases where we don't see that. So talking about life stressors, and I'm sorry this slide is in French, but the point basically is that we're just hopefully, getting out of a pandemic that increased quite a lot stress in the general population. Yes? So the first question that a lot of people had and concern is that associated with the stress that we lived as a population through the pandemic, we would have increased rates of suicide. But interestingly enough, that's not what we saw. It's quite the opposite. In fact, what we saw was, at least until now, yes, until the data that we have now, is that through the pandemic, there was a decrease in suicide rates. Yes? And so this is a study that was done looking at suicide rates in many countries around the world, and in general, yes, and in most of the places, there was a decrease in suicide rates, particularly, in the first phase of the pandemic, where we had data. Yet, there's still maybe in the second part, in the second year, things will be different, but so far the data, it's around there. So why? Why is it that seems even counterintuitive if you think about it, yet, that we went through so much stress as a whole, but yet suicide rates went down? So I cannot tell you for sure. I can only give you hypotheses of what is that we think about it. Yes? But one of the things we think is that because it's not just through the pandemic, it's similar phenomena is seen when a population, let's say, is at war or is going through war periods, yet suicide rates tend to go down. Not only did suicide rates go down, but a lot of measures of mental illness also, through at least the first phase of the pandemic, went down. Yes, for instance, we had in the hospital where I work, the first year of the pandemic, we had a significant decrease in consultations, yes, in number of referrals for psychiatric services, with maybe a few exceptions here and there, but in general, that's what we saw. So I think one insight into this is a comment that I got from a patient during the pandemic. The first phase, she said, "You know what, doctor? I feel normal now." Yes? Because now my experience is normalized in the sense that I'm not the only one who is suffering. I'm not the only one who is isolated. Yet everyone else is. And I think that may explain a little bit why this is the case. Yes? Because a lot of the triggers are about, yes, our individual experience, yes, about how we feel. And when a whole population is going through an external stressor that everybody leaves, there is increased cooperation, first of all. People, are work together, and a lot of the stressors that normally are in our day-to-day life are put aside. So I told you that one way to think about, one important predictor of suicidal behavior and one important risk factor is psychopathology. Yes? So in fact, when we look at individuals who die by suicide, about 90% of them were affected with a mental illness at the moment when they die by suicide. Yet, among these different mental illnesses, the most common by far is depression. Yet, so depression, between 50 and 90% of individuals who die by suicide, depending on age group, yes, were affected by an episode of major depressive disorder at the moment of death. Then there are frequently other conditions that may come in combination with or without depression. For instance, substance-related problems like alcohol and sometimes other drugs. Maybe as well other conditions that, for instance, bipolar disorder or schizophrenia as well, that associate strongly with suicidal behavior. But by far, really mood disorders, as a group, mood disorders, are depression, bipolar disorder that most closely associate with suicide risk. The lifetime risk, it's about 7% for males, for individuals with a diagnosis of depression, and 2.5% for females. And when we look at different factors, it's a history of suicide attempt is one of the most important predictors. Now, you have to take that with a grain of salt, because the vast majority of the people who have depression and have attempted suicide will not die by suicide. Yes, I showed you initially the graph of the relationship between thinking about suicide, attempting suicide, and dying by suicide. But these are really important risk factors and conditions that increase risk for suicide. When we look at the histories of individuals who had major depression, we see that commonly, but not exclusively, suicide occurs early on in the natural history of the illness. So commonly, it's more, in the first years of the illness that suicide tends to occur, perhaps because, as I told you, one of the risk factors has to do with impulsivity, and then if you are depressed and if you have those traits, then you're more likely to act on suicidal thoughts. Now, what do we know about what happens in the brain of individuals who are depressed and think about suicide? So there's a lot of findings that have been produced over the last decades, trying to better understand what happens in the brain of individuals who are depressed and think about suicide and are at risk of suicidal behavior. So I'm not going to go over all of them. It's just to summarize, the most important ones. So a lot of work points to changes in one neurotransmitter So one molecule that helps transmission in the brain in a part of the brain that's known as the raphe, and has to do with this neurotransmitter known as serotonin. Yet that individuals who manifest suicidal behavior, compare even with other individuals who are depressed or individuals who are not depressed, tend to have lower serotonergic transmission, and particularly lower as well serotonergic function in the raphe nuclei. We have as well evidence of decreased activity of the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of the brain here, that it's important in executive function. We have changes here in the anterior cingulate cortex, which is this region here of the brain, in orange, that acts as a hub, for processing of emotional information in the brain. And there are changes in a number of different factors, including in non-neuronal cells. There are changes as well in the hippocampus. There are changes in the amygdala, which are two other key areas of the brain important in processing emotions. Yet, so there are all these changes that have been produced over the years that are important to help us understand suicidal behavior. There are as well connections between the brain and other systems. So I told you, for instance, about the stress, the stress relationship between the adrenal gland and the brain, and how that goes through the stress axis. There's also a relationship between the gut and the brain through the microbiome. In other words, the collection of microorganisms that are in our gut, and there seems to be a dialogue between them and our brain and our emotions, even though we still don't know very well and understand how that happens, but it's important, and a number of other findings. But we still don't know, for sure what happens in the brain of individuals who are at risk of dying by suicide, but we're doing quite a lot of work. But I'm optimistic. Optimistic because technology has advanced over the last few years, and now we are able to do things that before we were only dreaming about. And one of the things we can do now, for instance, is study the brain one cell at a time through what we call single-cell experiments that allow us to really dissect the brain at each cell resolution. And that is key to better understand, because the brain remains an organ that is very little understood in terms of its function. Another key advance is with the finding that our cells of the brain and cells in the body release little vesicles, yes, that act and carry signals at a distance. These vesicles, known as extracellular vesicles or exosomes, that can be detected peripherally, even if they are released from cells in the brain. And then we can take those vesicles that are detected peripherally, put molecules inside, and deliver them to the brain in a way that eventually will be able to deliver treatment, yet, to individuals who are at risk of suicidal behavior. So, even though we don't understand everything, and there is a lot to get to know, we can still intervene, prevent, and help individuals who are at risk of suicidal behavior. So there's quite a lot of things, actually, that we can do. Yes. And the key it's in this circle. Yes? The approach is approach based on prevention, screening of individuals at risk, and effective diagnosis. Yes, identification. So prevention, we can do quite a lot of things to prevent suicide and suicidal behaviors. So first, we can develop interventions at the universal level by, for instance, decreasing access to means. Yes? So, for instance, decreasing access to firearms or making it difficult to use firearms in an impulsive way. For instance, I told you that impulsive traits are risk factors for suicide. So if someone who is more impulsive and has access to a firearm at a moment when the person is depressed and has suicidal thoughts, well, that's not a good idea. Yes? So preventing access, it's part of the process. Preventing access to places where people can die by suicide, for instance, bridges, or other places where people can jump. So that it also is very effective. Because many times these suicidal crises, they come and go. Yes? And they come, they're very, very strong. At the moment they come, the person cannot think about anything else. Yes? And so then they go. So if you are effective in preventing that the person acts out at that moment, yes, well, maybe it would never happen. Yes? So these are essential things that we can do to prevent. Working with media, yes, how we communicate about suicide and suicide risk and suicidal behavior. So, you know, sometimes when this is not properly communicated, leads to contagion effects, yes? If it's romanticized, for instance. You know, for instance, when Kurt Cobain died by suicide, there was a peak of suicides right after. So it's about how you communicate, because, you know, often media does not communicate what, you know, the suffering these people were going through. So it's idealized, it's romanticized, so that's important. And very importantly, awareness campaigns. Talk about it in the right way. Educate people and make sure that people are aware about the risk factors, are aware about what can be done to intervene and prevent. Then there are selective interventions that are more at individuals at risk, that have to do, for instance, with treatment, medical treatment to decrease risk, have to do with helping general practitioners, family doctors, to better identify individuals at risk and better treat them, so better educate family doctors, and developing treatment guidelines. And then there are interventions that help with prevention that are more guided, selected to individuals who have suicidal thoughts or are themselves manifesting suicidal behavior, and that have to do with, you know, psychotherapies, other social approaches that help people better develop skills to deal with difficulties and crisis services available in the general population, so where people can go when they are in a difficult moment. Screening, identifying people at risk, is also important. Yes, because although we don't have tools that specifically help us predict who will die by suicide, it is important for us to identify individuals at risk and be more targeted in our forms of intervention. And this can be in individuals who have psychiatric illnesses or individuals from the general population, etc. For instance, one important way of, of screening nowadays is through media, social media. Yes, a lot today is said in social media and through Facebook, for instance, and it's important to identify through algorithms, through artificial intelligence, people who are at risk so that help can be provided to them. Or adolescents, for instance, children who are all the time communicating through social media. And of course, doing effective diagnosis, identifying individuals who themselves are more at risk of suicide and suicidal behaviors. So once we do that and identify those individuals, what do we do? So the intervention is based on different approaches. So approaches that have to do, with support and psychological and social support and help. Yes, for instance, therapies and different forms of therapies. And then with pharmacological treatment to help these people as well. So it's a combination of all these interventions that are important and help us prevent and support individuals who are at risk. So to conclude, I started by saying that I don't want you to leave here thinking that suicide is either caused by early life stress or by genes or just by psychopathology, because that's not it. Yes, each person has an individual story. Each person has individual risk factors that only apply to them. Yes, suicide is complex when we look at it in general, and there are different factors that play a role. There are factors that increase predisposition in some individuals, like genes, but not in everybody. Yet, there are other factors that act through the lives of these individuals, and there is clearly life stressors that act more proximately and increase risks. Although there is a lot to learn, there is a lot that we already know that can be used to help those individuals who are at risk and prevent suicidal behavior. So with that, just going to leave you, and I'm happy to take questions, just to acknowledge that I gave you just a general overview, didn't get into any details, but still there is a lot of people who work with me behind the scenes and sometimes in front of the scenes to generate all this data that helps advance the work. And here they are. Thank you.
Dr. Turecki said he would take questions, so that there are any, I'll just call on you and try to do it in the order that I see the names.
I have a question. I was wondering, there's a book called Talking to Strangers, which is not about suicide, but they talk about this idea of coupling, of people being attached to a particular means, and if they don't have access to that means, they're unlikely to go on to commit suicide. But I was never able to find any research to support this random book I read. I'm wondering if that's a thing, or maybe not at all.
They are attached to a mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I never seen anything in particular about that. There may be something, but I just it didn't cross my view. I think that, but even if it was the case, yes, even if it is, I think that a way that I would explain it, yes, is through the same model that I presented, in the sense that stressors, yes, like for instance, losing something or not having access to something, they affect us all, yes? And we are affected by emotional reactions to life stressors. And sometimes these emotional reactions, they trigger conditions like depression, for instance, yes? And then with depression, we often have suicidal thoughts, So it's a way to understand all kinds of stressors that occur either from, or the relationship between stressors like that and suicide risk, for instance.
Just wanted to highlight one thing that you mentioned, and that is that in about 50% the suicide is preceded by suicide attempts, but that also means that in 50% the suicide happens out of blue without any previous warning, and quite often in the first episode of depression or bipolar disorder. And so I think this really highlights the need to be able to identify the risk factors early on so that we can anticipate the risk in those
So I don't know if everybody heard his comment, so I'm going to repeat it so to make sure that it was clear. So what Dr. Alda said was that in 50% of individuals, let's say, who are depressed and die by suicide, we see a history of previous suicide attempts, yes? But in 50%, we don't. And that highlights the need to better identify individuals who are at risk. And, I couldn't agree more with that. And I think this illustrates the difficulty to identify many times individuals who are at risk. Because, for instance, I told you that one very important risk of suicidal behavior is being depressed. But the vast majority of people who have depression will not die by suicide, even if they have suicidal thoughts. Then, so many times, even though we do the screening, as I told you, we identify risk factors, it's very difficult, yes, for us clinically to identify people who really are at risk. And this is why we need to advance in our understanding of these risk factors. That's why we need to do additional work to better predict who it's more likely, because first, it's a way to be more directive in the way we intervene. And you may have heard, for instance, that now when we are very concerned about someone who comes, let's say, at the emergency room, yet we can hospitalize the person, sometimes even against their own personal will. But it's all a clinical decision that we often use, yes, in the emergency. And it's based on the assessment of these risk factors that I told you. But these assessments are not very precise. Yes, if anything, they are not precise. So that's why we need to advance and better understand how the brain works, better understand how all these mechanisms interact, with the brain and also socially, and how to better help people who are at risk and provide better treatments and interventions so that we can be more effective.
Yes, Dr. Turecki, thank you for your talk. It's fantastic. I just wanted to ask you to expand a bit on prevention by way of restricting access to means based on the Canadian data that I've seen, there's pretty consistent story that's told with regards to the most common mechanisms or means that people employ to who actually end up completing suicide. And firearms, for example, are a very tiny percent, well, not a tiny, a small percentage. And jumping off of a height is a tiny percentage relative to, for example, access to toxic ingestions. And often there's a lot of energy, right, from municipalities and governments to do things like restrict access to bridges, right? But actually isn't necessarily where the major investment should be if we look at prevalence. So if we look at the most common means, what would you recommend to policymakers about how to restrict access to those more common means? Yeah, so you're right. Yes, so here in Canada, yes, firearms are luckily are not a main means of dying by suicide. There are in the States though, yes, but not here. And bridges are not either in terms of numbers, if you look. But I would argue that every effort is a good effort because they can save lives. Even if we save one life, yes, it's good, the effort. So I don't think that the energy should be, we're not to put the, we're not to limits, and I don't think that that's what you meant anyways, but I don't think that that's, I think that we should do everything possible to decrease access to all kinds of means, yes, including bridges. And so the most common cause of suicide in Canada is hanging, yes? And so it's very difficult to act specifically about that. But we can act on other means of suicide, like for instance, detoxification of gas, from cars. So that's one effective way because there's this is a common method. The other way that we can intervene is by reducing overdose, yes, or access to methods that lead to overdose. And there is one anecdote, for instance, or one example that illustrates how sometimes small measures can make an important impact. So, overdose by Tylenol, for instance, it can be lethal sometimes, yes? And the UK implemented a strategy quite a few years ago of reducing the number of pills available in Tylenol packages. So it's a small measure, yes, but that had a significant impact in terms of suicide prevention in the UK. So, if you go to the pharmacy and you get a package of Tylenol with 100 tabs, yes, it can be lethal. Whereas if you have a package with 15 tabs, it will not. So again, because these crises, they come and go many times, So if you have one package with 100 tabs, at home, then that's something these are small things that can be easily done. Yet, in places where there are metros, like in Montreal, Toronto, not sure if there is one metro here or subway, but, for instance, setting barriers, yes, that's standard now in many countries, yes, so they have barriers that people cannot jump in front of the metro. So not only that prevents deaths by suicide, but prevents a lot, because, we talked a lot about suicide, death by suicide, and we didn't talk a lot about suicide attempts. But suicide attempts, even if the person doesn't die, can be extremely disruptive to the person, to the life after, and there are consequences and there are impacts. Yet, so if there is a way, for instance, for you to prevent someone from jumping in front of the metro,
at a moment, and then the person can end up with, you know, handicaps and a number of different things. That is certainly worth it. I think there were 2 questions.
Hi, it was a great lecture, and I'm a suicide survivor, a couple of attempts, and I'm actually with Dr. Turecki at the National Register of Suicide and its Prevention in Ottawa, and it helped me because I was able to learn more about what I was going through, what I was experiencing. Sure, I was on medication and being with clinicians, but it just wasn't enough. And also, another thing that helps me is being around other survivors, being able to talk about it. And you're absolutely right. Like, I never realized until I joined the study that my suicide attempts were when I was stressed out and I was on the edge. But now, with the help of my psychiatrist, with doctors, with great people like CMHA and Larry Bev, I learned to be able to deal with the situation. And once I can, those moments leave, those suicidal ideations leave. So, again, I thought your lecture was great. It's just my concern is sometimes when it comes to clinical, they don't always understand the person coming in, whether they attempted or whether they are at risk. They just don't seem to understand. And that's where I feel like more studies or more changes have to be made. Because when that person reaches, that person obviously is at the end. They feel they're at the end. So they get to the hospital or they get to see the psychiatrist or the person that's going to help them. I fortunately had great doctors. I still have great doctors. But I've heard of situations where they're not great doctors and they're not taking the suicide attempt or the suicide seriously. So I believe more has to be done there. And it would just be helpful to be able to very openly talk to the doctors.
Thank you. Thank you, Juana. Thank you very much for your for sharing that with us. I fully agree. I think that, you know, there are lots of things that we can do, but the system is certainly not perfect yet. There are a lot of improvements that can be made. And I think that one of the problems has to do with the screening, the identification. Yes, that's why you said, for instance, that sometimes the clinician doesn't take seriously what the patient says. And it's in part because the clinician just is unable, I think, you know, or is not to identify well its risk. So there is part that has to do with education, yes. So there are lots of campaigns that target and help clinicians be better prepared to identify individuals at risk. And that's one of the things that we know from the literature, that they work and it works well. And there's other, you know, there's another part that has to do with creating better methods to screen, identify, and there's a long way to go on that front.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Turecki. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's informative and gives me hope. I think one of the things, well, there's multiple things that I'm a little bit concerned about because of the lack of general practitioners, family doctors, and we're in a crisis around the world. Globally, this is a huge issue. And in order to effectively assess or be connected to an individual, there has to be some sense of connection between the GP and the individual you're serving. I don't think all general practitioners have the maybe knowledge base to properly assess an individual, because some individuals who are potentially suicidal have a very good way of masking their what's going on inside versus what's going on outside. So they can definitely trick people into thinking they're well when there's a lot going on inside. I worry about the lack of general practitioners and a lot of it going virtual. Now, how that's going to impact an assessment of an individual if they're in a state of crisis or have suicide ideation or potentially have a suicide attempt, and how we're going to follow through on a prevention strategy or an intervention strategy if all we're seeing is from here to here and you're not watching body language or getting a real sense of trust and connection with that individual. The other thing I think is really important too, and this is a big, huge, not burden, but it requires a lot of a special person, I think. Peers in the school system, I think, are our greatest asset to be able to detect or assess their friends. And it might not be all of them, but if you can have that one peer who knows you and you have established a sense of trust with them, and you're giving cues, and that peer is smart enough or engaged in a sense of knowledge about you and your actions and your day-to-day way of being, to pick up on those cues effectively, that is a huge intervention and prevention strategy. Yeah. And I know with my son, there was an individual who he had written a letter to, and I picked up on one sentence that was his calling. And I can't expect her, because she doesn't have that knowledge base, right? And if she had just had that little bit extra, she would have gone like, that is a red flag, I gotta act on it.
So look, you're right, and you mentioned about different things. I didn't say anything, but there is actually a system that is based on this peer system that is extremely effective in certain communities or certain subgroups. Yes, for instance, in the army or in other places where you train someone to be there, available, who can help, support individuals who are under stress or at risk of suicidal behavior, and that's extremely effective. There are lots of studies showing that they are effective in reducing suicidal behavior. So that's important. I think the other point that you mentioned is detecting, and that, it reminded me to say, a couple words that, I told you that men are more at risk of dying by suicide, yes? But men usually are less keen to talk about their emotions, yes? They are less keen to share their emotional experience. We are wired in that way socially. And so we have to do a better job there, yes? We have to do a better job at creating systems where men can feel more comfortable to talk and to look for help and to express in a way that they can go and have access to the support that is necessary. So, for instance, there is interesting work done at that front with men that go to emergency rooms, for instance, and they are followed up by other men similar age that act as life coaches. Yes? So in that situation, for instance, which is not the same as you going to an office, sitting in a chair and talk, yet that seems to work well for at least some men. Yet, so we need to better understand, and maybe that's where we need to invest. Yes, because you're right. Access to general practitioners, specialists, it's difficult, yes? And so if there are other professionals, other people that can be available and targeted, for instance, to certain groups, yes? So in that way, we can be more effective in actually preventing. Yes? Now, for the virtual thing that you said, so I don't know how things are evolving here. I hope that with time, we'll go back to everything in person. But I don't know. Maybe some of it would, would stay.
Hi, I'd like to thank you for your talk. It was really nice, very helpful. And I also want to express my sympathy to the family that lost their son. My son was 17 when he used cannabis, and he had his first episode of psychosis. So this is more of a concern for me to get it out there. And I see all your people up there on the screen, so it's helpful to see that hopefully someone is out there working against this. We did talk a lot about the drug abuse with the suicide tendencies, but my concern is that it's getting into the hands of young children. I mean, if you're an adult and want to use a joint on the weekend, no problem. I mean, you're big, you're growing up, you're going to be who you're going to be. That's not a big deal. But I think it's getting into the hands of our youth, and that is very concerning. If you buy a pack of cigarettes, it'll say health issues, you can get this, this, and this, and cancer. You go and get cannabis. It doesn't say there's a risk of anxiety and psychosis and frontal lobe involvement if you're less than 25 years old. So I'm really passionate about it, and I just want to bring that concern to the group tonight. And I wish I had money because I'd be out there advocating for it, but I'm not. If you guys can do anything to stop cannabis and to try to get it out to especially teenagers, because my son says to me now, he said, I wish I knew what I knew now. He said, I would have done things a lot different. There was no education in the school. He didn't have any idea, and we argued. I said, Tyler, you can't, this is not something good for you. He said, Mom, we're legalizing it in Canada. The grown-ups are saying this is good, so you got to be okay. So that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to bring that up.
Thank you for sharing that with us. So it is a problem, yes, and psychosis that sometimes is triggered by the use of cannabis, particularly early on.
We did have suicide thoughts. With the psychosis, and thank God he didn't, but he did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the studies that we've done, about 7% to 10% of individuals who died by suicide had psychosis. Yes, had primarily psychosis, and so as you pointed out, it can be triggered by the use of drugs, whether cannabis, but not only cannabis as well, psychostimulants, many times use of amphetamines, cocaine can lead to and precipitate, a psychotic episode. So, and with that, particularly in younger people are particularly more susceptible following one episode of psychosis early on to develop depressive thoughts and have suicidal thoughts with it. So you're right. It is important, and that's one of the major concerns of a lot of scientists and clinicians that work in this area when cannabis was legalized, was that it would lead, it would have an impact in younger people at a moment where their brains are still, which I believe that's what you mentioned by, and other people, but at the moment where the brains are not yet fully formed yet and fully ready, so that unfortunately it's a big problem.
Is there anything being done, like
so?
Anyway, this is someone else can have a topic. That's okay. No, I
think that there are things can be done. It's just that it's also a societal issue. That at the particular moment in time, the pressures were in the opposite direction. So,
J.P. Allen is having a talk this week, because this is Mental Health Week, and they're actually having a talk with parents to talk about campus and the use of computers. So that's really helpful to see that. That's nice.
yeah.
We'll take one more question. There was one. Yes.
I was wondering if you had any data related to sleep disorders and prolonged sleep deprivation and suicide rates.
So the question was whether or not I have any data on sleep disorders or sleep deprivation and suicide rates. Yes? So we do have some data on that. And interestingly enough, I don't know if you're aware, but sleep deprivation is one, can be used as a treatment to depression. Yet, so we sometimes, there are forms of treatment for more severe depression that are based on sleep deprivation. Yet, now it cannot be done, over long periods of time, But so what the point is that sleep deprivation impacts mood. Yet, and when individuals have changes in mood, one of the first symptoms that we see is sleep changes. Yet, so very often, either in one way or another, either in insomnia or more difficulties to sleep, and hypersomnia or increased amounts of sleep. So when we look at patterns of sleep in individuals who die by suicide, we invariably see an increase in insomnia. Yes, which is interesting because there is this association that I told you, and then I mentioned quite a lot about between depression and suicide. Yes, but in depression it can happen both. Sleep too much or less. But we have an excess among individuals who died by suicide and were depressed of individuals that had insomnia. Yes, so whether that has anything in particular in terms of cause or not, I don't know yet, but this is an interesting finding that we've and others tried to explore, including looking at moment of death during the day and the impact, but there's nothing very concrete that I can tell you other than what I just said.
There's someone who had her hand up earlier who I missed, so we'll get this the last question.
Sorry, other people didn't get to ask about the social determinants of health and so on. We could really have a kinder, better society, but I have a bit of a weird question that I don't know if it's weird, but have there been studies on other animals like primates, and do they ever exhibit suicidal behavior?
So the question was whether or not there are animals other than humans that exhibit suicidal behavior. And so this is certainly not a weird question. It's actually quite an important one. And thank you for asking it. The easy answer to it is that no, there are no animals that exhibit, suicidal behavior as such. There's, if you look in the internet, or perhaps you heard that lemurs die by suicide, but that's not exactly the case, or that scorpions can kill themselves, in certain conditions. But no, in fact, as far as I know, there are no animals that actually die by suicide. But there are animals, though, that expose themselves to increased risk, yes, or situations of risk. And so in the literature, those have been used as models, for instance, to help us better understand suicide. But it would be good if we did have animal models that could be used to help advance the understanding, and of what happens on suicide. But unfortunately, we don't.
Thank you for your questions. Pauline has gone through these things.
I just want to thank you, Dr. Turecki, for venturing to our beautiful province of Nova Scotia, which has been really cold lately. Considering it's May, we are all hoping the sun will shine soon. Your talk was very informative. It gave me hope. I think the research that you've done has made strides in looking at the behaviors and the prevention and intervention strategies. I think everyone in this audience can agree that we all want to work towards prevention and intervention and get out of the crisis mode that we're currently experiencing. And not only in Nova Scotia, I think this is a situation that's happening globally in many aspects. But I think if we work collectively and collaboratively and intelligently, I think we can address these situations. I think my philosophy is that if we work, like one person can make a small bit of change, the woman in the green coat, you can, even if you don't have money, you can make a small change in making strides in your concern about marijuana use. One person can be impacted by a very small stride. I think having lost my son in April 2017 by suicide, one person lost by suicide is one too many. So we have to change that, and I believe wholeheartedly that we can do that. It just means we have to switch our brains to look at intervention and prevention versus working in crisis mode. And I think we can do that together. So thank you for venturing out to our beautiful province of Nova Scotia. And if you head back to Montreal and it's sunny, blow it around our way. Thank you so much. This is a little surprise to the cows too. I cannot tell you how honored I was to meet Pauline and Elliot. We still share, unfortunately, a very heartfelt emotion of loss by our sons. You have done something miraculous by bringing Dr. Turecki here and helping to better inform the public and everybody in the audience on what changes we can make to help reduce the level of suicide in our community, and make families and not have to worry about the concerns of loss or the feelings or emotions that are attached to that. So thank you so much for all you've done. You've worked tirelessly, endlessly, and with a heart and goal from both of you and your families who are here to celebrate and learn from this wonderful presentation. So thank you so much. I'd love to give you a hug, but we will just do the hug. Thank you so much.
The organizations that I mentioned at the outset, I'd like to just bring them back to mind, starting with the Canadian Mental Health Association, the Halifax Dartmouth branch, represented by Bev Cadam and Mark Murray, the Dalhousie Department of Psychiatry. We had support from the Association of Psychologists of Nova Scotia. All of these people have been terrific working with Elliot and me to make this possible. So thank you very much. And to say the very, at the very least, thank you very, very much for Dr. Turecki. He has been terrifically good from the very outset. His willingness to come was extraordinary, and it was a great lift to our family that we could mount an event of this sort. Lastly, for thank yous, the Central Library has been magnificent, largely in the case of this event, in the person of Alison Black, a terrifically good librarian. She's just been the very, very best. So thank you. The poet Emily Dickinson, at the time of the death of her young nephew, she wrote these words to her sister-in-law, who was the child's mother. "The first section of darkness is the densest. After that, light trembles in. May much and meaningful light continue to tremble in on this field of study, and may it widely enable outcomes that reduce the scale of suffering and loss that is the signature of mental illness and suicide." Once again, thank you from our family to all of you. Thank you for coming. Good night and safe home.